We're here today with Greg Finn to talk about one of Google's recent changes that it didn't take long in 2023 for Google to say something that caused a huge uproar. So, Greg, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I have an agency, Cypress North, out of beautiful Buffalo, New York. I help put together some of the shows like SMX and do some of the paid tracks for those few shows each year. And I've got a podcast, Marketing Clock, every Friday as we kind of run through the news and rant and rave and just have a good time.
So let's rant and rave. So Google takes, 4 days into 2023 to make an announcement that we got people like doing a double take, right? So what exactly did they announce?
Yeah, so it was January 4th, and they said you've got 15 days for anybody that's opted into an auto-applied recommendation, the remove redundant keywords recommendation. And initially, this recommendation would remove redundant keywords that were the same match type in any ad group out there. And so basically, people kind of judge like some of these recommendations, and they're kind of like, these ones might be a little bit safer than the other ones. And this was kind of, I think some people thought that this was a safer one, right? So that you have something in your account and it's going to overlap. Yeah, you might just want one keyword there to kind of get all the volume and not split it up between two. Like it sort of makes sense. So the email said, well, now we're not going to, it's going to kind of cross over match types and you've got 15 days. So people that had opted in, they've got 15 days, and then that recommendation is, changing as a whole starting January 19th.
All right, and to break that down a little bit, so there's really two things that has people concerned, right? The first one is you've opted in previously to allow Google to do automatically applied optimizations. Oh, and by the way, that thing that you approved us to do last year, we're going to change the type of work that but that approval is still valid. It's kind of like going to a contractor and signing a contract to put to paint your house white, and then he goes on vacation, comes back from vacation, and he's like, "Hey, I'm actually just going to paint it red. You already signed the contract, but I'm going to change the terms of the whole thing." That's kind of what Google did here, right?
Yeah, and I don't want to I don't want to kind of go too far. Like the change that they're making isn't like an astounding change. You still would have had to have a broad match keyword in the ad group. But it's going to prefer the broad match keyword now, and so you wouldn't have needed that in the ad group. But it is a substantial change to what you had opted into. So now you're making more work saying like, oh, I approved this. Now I have to go read these emails. I have to go reassess everything and make sure that this is still the case. So, to me, there's sort of like the two flavors of it, right? One is it's going to choose the broad match keyword, which face value, not that big of a deal unless you've got some impression share or something or other you're working on. But two, the bigger, I think, concern is that, people approve this recommendation that was a set recommendation, and that's now changed, and you still have been approved for it, and you only had 15 days to change.
Exactly. So if you happen to not have caught that email or this video or many of the tweets that were out about it, you'd wake up January 20th, and all of a sudden your automatic optimizations would have been doing different work than what they did the day before.
You hit the nail on the head. And then I'd say as well, it's like that's a slippery slope, right? Like that is changing. People applied it to kind of basically clean up the match type, the keywords in the same match type. Now you're crossing over to different match types. And I guess naively didn't think this would ever be possible, So then I'm now thinking, well, what's going to be coming next, right? Like this at face value isn't a horrible change, but what's next? What can happen next to these recommendations, and what's coming down the pipe?
Yeah, and I suppose it's that whole theme that's sort of been an undertone of Google pushing more and more for broad match keywords and let the machine figure out the targeting, and we should be more hands-off on it. And we started seeing that a number of years ago when exact stopped being exact. And so I just want to point here to the screen share that I have, but I took this from, I think it was directly from Google's email. But in the example, if you have two keywords, women's hats in a phrase match and a broad match, ladies' hats, like these are considered redundant keywords. And so it's not like duplicate keywords, but it's redundant. And what they're saying is ladies' hats is close enough to women's hats. It'll show for that query anyway. So we're taking away the control over that keyword. Now, if you look at the previous slide, and then love you to comment, but so currently they say a keyword is considered redundant if it's within the same ad group, destination, bid strategy, and match type. Now they're taking away the match type, right? So it still has to have the same destination URL. It has to be sort of like targeting the same ad group with the context of the audiences and with the same bid strategy. But like, to what degree is this taking away control that an advertiser in the past would have said, well, you know, women's hats and ladies' headwear is different enough at some level that I kind of wanted to do something different? Or are the other things that Google looks at covering for those possibilities?
Yeah, and you know, everybody has their own preference for setting up campaigns, and for us, we don't use auto applied recommendations. It's I like looking at the things, you know, taking what things, you know, might make sense and applying as needed. But in that example where we've got like the women's hats, that's in a key in the same campaign with something like ladies' hats, you might be an advertiser out there that's, and this is where I don't exactly get why they're making this change. But maybe, you know, women's hats is your bread and butter and you see a much higher conversion rate and everything's going well with it. So what it's going to do then is, you know, you're not going to be showing for women's hats anymore. And apparently, even if your bid was higher, it's going to be a redundant term, right? And it's going to go back towards ladies' hats. And then the thing as well that really could be a problem, right, in people's accounts. Let's say that, you know, it's just broad match in general, right? If you're defaulting towards the majority of broad match, you really want to make sure it's you've got smart bidding on, right? Like, I don't think anybody really likes having smart bidding. But, you know, if you've got a bunch of keywords in the same campaign and you're spending more because you're bidding higher on things that are exact match, again, you probably it makes sense because in order for this to hit you, you have to have that broad match term in there. But you're going to probably spend a lot more on broad match, obviously, if your exact match terms are considered redundant, your phrase match are considered redundant, and people might just not know that.
Should people turn off the automatic applies for this and start managing redundant or duplicate keywords another way?
Yeah, so I put a post out on Search Engine Land, and, you know, the fact that I again, naively, I thought if you agree to a recommendation, you know, that's what you're opting into. And the fact that this is going to kind of fundamentally change the way that the recommendation works, I don't know how anybody could feel comfortable, you know, opting into these, because you're really going to have to pay attention now and see what the recommendation is changing, what it's morphing into, like what's going on. You know, and this wouldn't be a problem if it was just a new recommendation that said, hey, it's redundant keywords across match types. Would you like to opt into this? You know, and I think the problem that people have is you're not opting into this. You agreed on something in 2022, and in 2023, that is changing, and it's making more work for you. And, you know, that's the slippery slope, I think. That's kind of a dangerous precedent, you know, to have the ability to change these things that you've already agreed to, in post, and only have, you know, a few weeks to see that.
So you still stand by the tweet that we're seeing on screen here, basically saying this should have been a different recommendation?
Yeah, I think that's fair. You know, the whole point of that first recommendation, the way that they got people to opt into it, was the fact that it would help to remove redundancy within a match type. That is not what the recommendation is here, January 19th, 2023. It is a different implementation. So, you know, I think it should have been something added on. Maybe it's something that could be a pop-up, but to put it into somebody that had approved a different recommendation on face value between the same match types, I don't think that's, I think that this is, it's dangerous.
Yeah, it makes it harder for people to, in the future, accept some of the valid recommendations that Google makes, because there is worry that you're not just accepting what makes sense today, but that you're opting into a lot more stuff, and we don't know what that stuff is. And it's sort of also the theme in the ongoing automation of the industry. We're all fighting for some modicum of control and some, insurance that the system isn't doing something crazy. And so this is yet again a piece of control that's being taken away, I think.
Right. And to me, it's that control. And I think that there's some distrust, at least for me, when we're looking at these recommendations. And I wrote about it in the article, but when you see all the recommendations load, it's things like we should expand with search partners. You should raise budgets. What is not a possible recommendation is lower budgets, right? So when we look at these recommendations, even things like upgrade to broad match, like some of these recommendations are probably going to make you spend more money as an advertiser or as a client. And unfortunately, it's the small, medium-sized businesses that either can't afford a good consultant or are kind of doing it on their own that are probably going to get taken for this. So to me, until you start seeing that where it's like, hey, lower your budgets on this campaign, I just don't think that the recommendations are fully aligned from like a fiduciary standpoint for advertisers.
Right. And part of the reason for that is that the system looks at the headroom opportunity, and that's how it decides to make a recommendation. And so headroom is always about additional opportunity. So Google kind of comes at it from the assumption that we all want more conversions, but oftentimes not from the perspective that maybe we would like those conversions to be cheaper per conversion or have a higher return on investment. And so that's where the directionality is always like spend more, increase your budgets, add more keywords, make your keyword match type looser, because that opens up the funnel. And then so, yes, additional conversions are great, but there comes a point at which the cost for those additional conversions is just like off the charts, right? And that's actually so in Optmyzr, the tool that we have, we think about that very hard because we actually do show some of Google's recommendations in our tool as part of the workflows. Because if you're using Optmyzr, it makes sense to do all of your work in there. But we take those Google recommendations and we apply one more layer of logic on top of that and say, we'll only tell you to increase the budget if we can also calculate that the incrementality, the incremental CPA is well within or very close to what you're currently doing, right? And then it makes sense because if you're already happy with a $20 CPA, then why not give you more at $20 and raise your budget? But if it means raising your budget, then all of a sudden now your cost per acquisition on average is going to go up to 25. Well, then, yeah, maybe those are not extra conversions you want. And so it's kind of like that whole thought process that, like you said, if you're not a sophisticated advertiser, if you don't have an agency, if you don't have a good tool, you're kind of being led down this path that's maybe not doing exactly what it is you were hoping.
Exactly. And that's one thing, like Optmyzr, you have the data and share that data, out in the public. And, with this change, I think that there was maybe one sentence that it was should have equivalent performance or something like that, and I think that's another aspect, right? Like making the case with data, showing people that, showing that extra layer makes sense. In this case, I just don't think it was enough from Google directly.
I know there was a little bit of chatter then on Twitter. So I love this one here from Anu. Yeah, right after they pressed send on that email. And listen, I was at Google when we did some of the changes around quality score, and it was like, yeah, we knew there was no good way to do this. And you were just hoping for the best. And maybe dancing like these two here.
I think if somebody is listening to this after the 19th and is like worried or something, this isn't a huge change to the redundant recommendation here. So there might be somebody at Google doing this dance, but this isn't like a super egregious. Again, you still would have to have that broad match keyword mixed in with the different match types in an ad group. It's just a change of the definition.
Hey, and maybe we were all just a little bit bored after the holidays and we're like, oh, come on, Google, say something that we can jump on. Here was Amy's tweet, and then a number of people, pretty highly respected people there, weighing in and saying that they're not a huge fan of that particular change. And then, of course, Google did come back and weigh in. So thanks to Ginny for always being on the pulse of what we are worried about. So she provided a few answers. Was there anything in this tweet that you thought was interesting and maybe worth covering?
I mean, I think it was pretty much PR speak. So there was a tweet from Mike Ryan at Mike Ryan Retail on Twitter, and him and his company had actually seen this as what appeared to be a test into his account. So they identified it. We're talking with the rep. The rep said that it was a bug, and there might be some compensation potentially due to this being in his account. And I thought that was interesting in general too, that was the case. And then Ginny replied to that and tried to clarify it as well, saying that there are some tests that go out. There was also probably a bug within this test, so sort of like everything's true. But I thought that just kind of look into things as to how some of these tests are going on is pretty enlightening if you look at some of those responses from her on her @ads liaison account. And then also the fact that there are always experiments running. So I guess, again, naively, I didn't know that some of these auto-applied recommendations have these tests baked in that, you're signing up for when you, have those set up on your account. Again, not a big auto-applied recommendation guy over here.
Yeah, very interesting. Hey, well, Greg, thank you so much for sharing. Folks, watch Marketing O'Clock or listen to Marketing O'Clock and follow Greg on Twitter and all of the other places. We'll put it right there on the screen. But thanks for weighing in and your thoughtful response to this big change from Google.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I had a blast.